There we go. All right, welcome to a very special edition of Fright School right here on the Geekscape Network. I'm Joshua, as most of you know, and today I am joined by Zefyr Lisowski, who is a poet, essayist, educator, author of two poetry collections, Blood Box and Girl Work, and the forthcoming essay, Uncanny Valley Girls, Essays on Horror, Survival, and Love, which comes out October 7th and is the subject of today's discussion. Zefyr, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My cat's also making a cameo right now. So I guess she's a co-interlocutor, but I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. I love that. My cats will probably scream outside the door. We'll see. And if it gets too much, we'll let them in and see what happens. All right. So I had the pleasure of getting an advanced copy of this incredible collection of essays. And so I've been reading it, as you could tell, I really enjoyed it. Today I'm in my partner's office just because I like his setup a little bit better. But if we were in my space, you'd see I've got like 1,000 books. So I read a ton. I love to read. And I don't think I've ever read anything quite like your book. It's just this really cool intersection of like memoir, horror analysis, queer theory, just unlike anything I'd ever read. As I was going through, I was trying to think like, where would I put this in the library? Like where would I, because it reminded me, obviously, of horror analysis books like, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which you talk about. And a lot of the books obviously reference horror analysis pieces, but also like, Audre Lorde Zombie, A Little Girl Interrupted. I was just like, wow, this is just coming together in a lot of different spaces. And it was just a really incredible read. So I just wanted to kind of start off with that, fangirl a little.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear that it resonated. And those books that you referenced are among my favorites. They are really sort of profoundly important to me. So I'm glad to hear them invoked as well.
Awesome. Well, that's good. Because obviously all compliments. All right, so I wanted to kind of start. So I found this interview with you in the Massachusetts Review in 2023, and I really liked, you said, I believe poetry at its most comprehensive is a practice of care. So the labor of those who work in care-related fields, doulas, community members, support networks, deeply influence how I move through the world on page, open-hearted and unshying every day, which obviously this book, yes, it is very unflinching. The preface opens up with you discussing your time in a psychiatric facility. And that chapter ends with, I don't want to write a life without viscera or rewrite any pain endured as less intense than it was. It would be dishonest to both my life and the lives of those I love. So yes, I was right in the ward. This is a story of loss, and this is also a story of love. And both the horrors are ceaseless. In fact, it's all the same story. The horrors are how I found myself. So let's begin there. I promise at the end, it will all shape into care. I just really loved how you kick this book off. So I'm kind of curious if we can just kind of start there. When did you start working on this project? When did you start seeing oh, there's something bigger here than, an essay or something that I can encapsulate, in sort of one piece?
That's a really good question. I started sort of beginning to think through the kernels that became this book in 2019 or so. But the first essay in it, which was The Girl, The Well of the Ring, was written in 2020, early 2020. It began as a pandemic project. And then I continued writing, and it sort of became auto-narrational as I was going on. And I was writing up, I believe one of the essays sort of talks about it being written in real time as this sort of breakdown occurred that kind of accumulated in a stay in a psychiatric facility. And after that was really the sort of opening up of the book project and really gave a lot of the moral and political impetus behind the book. And a draft was completed about a year after that time. And then I sort of sat and spent some time tinkering and writing over it as well. So it's been about a 5-year inception process for this.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Mhm.
5 years. That's amazing. Yeah, it's very, it's so timely as well because I know, so, full disclosure, my day job is I'm a therapist. And so in reading your book also, there's something else I was thinking about was like these intersections that were really, I feel have been there for a long time for, various, ways that we process our mental health, our experiences in the world, right? Through horror. But this is coming at a time when I feel like we're really talking a lot more seriously about that, or taking it more seriously and having conversations even in the field about fear, anxiety, how we're processing with horror, with trauma, with true crime, processing of trauma with true crime, whether or not that's good or bad, here it is, here or there. It's a fact, So yeah, I was really. I think I was really moved by a lot of your, very frank discussions of your own mental health and the field itself, and sort of, what it just in general gave me a lot to think about and to consider. Was that something that you were kind of thinking about, like critique of the system itself, or it was just like, hey, this is my experience?
Of course. I think that there definitely is a kernel of abolitionist critique of systems that's embedded in the book. But I was also interested in staying true to the experientiality of it, which is a kind of complex experience, right? I sort of have had these often fractious relationships with these spaces of like psychiatric institutes, like palliative care, as I also talked about with my father's passing. But at the same time, these also are spaces of complex care, and I didn't want to simplify the narrative that I was telling for the sake of political expediency.
Okay. Yeah, it was. I mean, it just really came through very powerful. Just again, that unflinching, that willingness to kind of go there, which is, I think, is what this book.
Yeah.
One of the things that's doing so well. Obviously, I think what will probably draw, or at least obviously pulled me into like, oh yes, I definitely read this and talk about this, is like a love of horror. And so I'm kind of curious, where did that start for you? Like, sometimes we often on our show, we talk about horror as like an heirloom, like it's something that gets passed down, like you have that, either a parent or maybe, an uncle, or you go to like a slumber party, right? Somebody else's like brother or sister, right? Oh, you all gotta watch this movie together. Or, it's like a pastime in a way. So I'm curious kind of where it started for you.
Yeah, there are two sort of origin stories, one of which I talk about in the book, one of which I don't. And the one that I talk about is having this early, almost sentimental attachment to these old black and white Universal monster movies, especially The Wolfman, which is a film that really meant a tremendous amount to me growing up. So having this kind of melancholic sort of relationship to these movies, which are a little bit sad, a little bit eerie, a little bit empathetic, but also kind of out of time, which made them a little bit more palatable as well, was really key to my kind of awakening with horror. But then the flip side of that as well is something that happened when I was in elementary school, which is I tried to rent the 1920s Lon Chaney Phantom of the Opera from a Blockbuster. And there was some sort of mix-up that happened, and I got this 1980s slasher remake starring Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger. That like very few people I've even met like have seen this movie. It's truly a kind of like obscure, like very of its moment kind of remake. And it's very silly in hindsight. I rewatched it again, but at the time it terrified me. It was this really visceral, really violent film in a paradigm that I wasn't used to. And for better or for worse, my mom sort of sat me down and was like, okay, if you stop watching this movie, what you imagine is probably going to be worse than what actually happens. So I continued watching the entire film. And of course, I had nightmares for months. But I think having that experience still kind of gave me a lens into sort of the power that really visceral horror can have as well, which is another one of the focal points of this book.
I love those kinds of stories. My mom once rented the Rocky Horror Picture Show because she thought it was Creep Show. She just, and so we all gathered around, and we were all pretty young and watching it. It was this very formative kind of experience, because then she stopped it because it was me and my very young cousins. Like, even I would say, I started seeing horror films very, very early in life because my mom was a big horror fan. So Creep Show, totally okay to show to a bunch of children. Rocky Horror Picture Show, not. Which kind of started a fascination when I was, 9 or 10. Like, I have to find this movie and finish watching it because, that's always what happens, right? If she would have just let it play, we probably would have never, really put it together what was going on in it. Because she stopped at the part where Frank is like tracing his finger down Rocky's belly. She's like, okay, I don't know what's happening. No more of this. So I love that as kind of a story, sort of accidental, like a mix-up. I think it's that's great. And of course, Robert Englund. Had you seen A Nightmare on Elm Street prior to that?
Not at that point. Of course, I love
Okay.
Nightmare. There's a whole subcanon of movies that I deeply adore that have just been subject to so much dissection. I didn't feel like I could add anything else to the conversation in this book. But Nightmare on Elm Street is one of those. It's a movie that's very close to my heart.
I'm glad you that was one of my questions I was going to ask, because you talk about, it's all over the place. Pet Cemetery, The Ring, Black Swan, The Wolfman, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, today, Saint Maud, Scream. You kind of are all like, it's a wide gamut of films, and not always ones that I've seen a lot of analysis. So I was curious, like, how did you choose the films that you were going to cover? Because that's, I'm sure, like I don't know, is there pressure like from, your editors, like, oh, do movies that people know and love, right? Or be, honest with yourself about what films you really want to speak to. So how did you choose the overall, the films that you chose?
That's a good question. I was interested in alternate canons for one. So I think a lot of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the only really like hard canonized film, I would say, that I like discuss in this movie, because that's just such a important movie to me. It really kind of became a way for me to, as I write about in the book, grow to love the South and grow to love kind of being a Southerner, kind of paradoxically, because it's such a dread-filled movie. But I really found a point of connection there. But beyond that, the initial conception of this book was pairing movies with the people I watched them with. So that changed somewhat as the book evolved alongside edits. But initially, I was interested in connecting these movies with specific relationships that I had memories of. And that kind of, by default, shaped the movies that I was interested in talking about. And I was also interested in this larger kind of canon of films that engage with female neurosis or psychosis or fear or instability. Greer Lankton has this incredible book, House of Psychotic Women, that is all, it's sort of it's a combination memoir and encyclopedia of female neurosis in movies, as she calls it. But I was also interested in thinking about what are the ways in which women's madness, either in the subject position as a protagonist of a movie, like we see at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or in this kind of more antagonistic position, as we see in also Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? Leatherface wears lipstick. But I was interested in the way that plays out, and that I wanted that to be a kind of subconscious theme of the book as well.
Yeah, I actually really like that sort of framing. Like throughout the book, you address you and I did this, you and I reached for each other, you and I, as we watch this film, which I really like, because I think that there's that line in Candyman about Candyman making lovers cling closer to each other in the dark, right? And horror being this kind of thing that, even though it's scary and not necessarily erotic in itself, there's something about that, about kind of coming together being together with somebody that you care about while watching a horror film. One of the things I love, so this is also For me, horror is a love language. Horror at its most intimate is a way to share the secret parts of yourself with others, what frightens you, what comforts you, what you're nonplussed by. At the start of so many relationships I've cared about, we couldn't relate to each other and smoothed over the distance with horror movies humming in the background. We substituted the things in our life that scared us for the things on a screen. Yes. I thought that was such a beautiful way to describe, our relationship with horror, our relationship with each other. I thought that was really a beautiful way to put that. I was going to go back to Texas Chainsaw because, I'm a huge fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's one of those movies, I think, when you're a kid and you tell people you've seen it, because a lot of my friends were not allowed to watch the kind of movies that I was allowed to watch. So I was a weird queer kid, wore a lot of black. My family, we were all kind of, spooky kooks, I like to say, but also very poor. But we had that in common together, watching horror movies. And my mother had me very young, so again, very tenuous grasp on sort of appropriateness level for children. So we watched a lot of horror. And so, you kind of go to school and it's like, man, I've seen all these like films that other people kind of talk about, or it's that sort of thing. It's like, are you brave enough to watch it? And there is, I love how you describe like the verdant green of like her eye and how beautiful the film is. And it's like this broad daylight kind of setting, which is what I've always thought was kind of really horrifying about it. It's like these kinds of things aren't supposed to happen on a nice day trip, into town or whatever, it's this group of kids, and just, this beauty of the South, I thought was very, very interesting. And I think, which we'll talk a little bit more when we get to Scream, because I want to kind of talk about that in a bit. But the South often is kind of considered this thing to escape from, and Texas Chainsaw obviously has kind of contributed to this mythos to it in a way, like it's a dangerous place that's also beautiful. Other thoughts on that? I thought that was a really cool way to frame Texas.
Well, thank you. That really means a lot to me. I think that there are these two facets of my identity that kind of revolve around that, right? I'm both a Southerner and I'm also someone who left the South. And it was really important to me when I was writing this book to articulate the reasons why I left the South without contributing to the narrative that I'm better for doing so, or that the South is a place to leave. And I think one of the ways to do that is to speak to both the violence and the complexities there, both racially and in terms of class politics, which are so to the forefront in the Southern United States, both of them, but also the ways in which it's a sort of stunningly physically beautiful place, and also a place that has really tight-knit and really complex familial ties as well. And I think one of the things that's so brilliant about Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the beauty of it, the sort of way it's lit, and also the two kind of families that are at its core. It's a movie about family, found family, chosen family, and literal family, and the tensions and unities that are present there as well.
Yeah, that was something that your book gave me sort of, I almost want to revisit, because we did in our first season, because the kind of crux of our show is that my friend who usually hosts it with me was not a horror fan. And he had been joining us to watch American Horror Story, and there were all these other horror fans around. And we were talking about how American Horror Story kind of used frames, music, like they did things that were homages to like American horror films. My friend's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I was like, oh, we should come over like a crash course in horror. And then we were like, should we make a podcast out of this? Because that's what you do. And that's kind of what that was the genesis of it. So we did Texas Chainsaw in the first season because I thought I put together I think it was 16 films that I thought represented like 100 years of horror advancement. And so Chainsaw definitely a turning point, I think, in horror. We can kind of stick a pin in that, and also tying into like the 60s, the Vietnam War, and all this, sort of change in the family and sort of the anxieties that it kind of represents, right? It was really easy to like go, yes, that. But I think even in our our original episode, we too were very like, man, Franklin, like, dude, again, because it's like, I think you're right. Like there is this, like ableism, or just everybody hates Franklin. And in reading what kind of your take on him and these two families centered around an individual with some kind of disability, and how they like mirror each other, I was like, oh my gosh, how did I never see that? I mean, it makes sense because we just live in a very ableist culture, and he's in a wheelchair, but he's whiny, right? Whiny, and he's you're just kind of primed to not like him, and all the characters you're supposed to like don't like him, so you just kind of, it's so mean girl energy. So I just really appreciate. I was like, oh my god, this is really kind of incredible, to rethink, Franklin and what happens to him, and what that kind of says about us. Just, it was one of those moments, and one of the many moments in your book that I went, okay, as a horror fan, I need to sit back a little bit and think a little bit more through,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, one of the interesting things about writing this book was, like, through writing it, I kind of had some of those realizations myself as well. I am someone who sort of thinks through a lot in my writing, and a lot of these movies, I think The Ring is a really good example of this as well, where it wasn't until I started writing the essay about The Ring which is a film that, like many people in my generation, like deeply terrified me, right? It was like a really frightening film, especially if you're younger when it comes out. And I think it took me until rewatching it in preparation for the essay that I read about it to realize that part of what's so frightening about it is it's a movie that, at least in the American remake, because they lower the age of Samara, it's a film that kind of launders child abuse. It's a pro-child abuse movie, which is horrifying and reflects so much about the priorities of society as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In reading that, I think, which I first read that particular essay in It Came From the Closet, which, awesome. Hey, listeners, watchers, check this out too. Lots of great queer thoughts on horror in there. But yeah, it's funny because I did about 6 months in working in family therapy, and you have these parents who bring their children in, and they're like, something's wrong with my kid, and you're meeting with a kid, and you're like, oh, there's something wrong with somebody, something's going wrong, but not the child. And that again also made me kind of rethink, how we approach The Ring, and how how's Samara like the bad guy? Or was it Sadako in Ringu? Like how does this happen? Like, so also, very beautiful. And just that whole chapter's discussion, like, with Pet Cemetery, and talking about the sister Zelda, and just just the monstrosity of girlhood, womanhood, disability, mental, all of these intersections, how they are made monstrous instead of, we should be, I read Judy Heuman's book, and it really kind of makes you think about, like, if you were lucky if you're lucky to be born in an able body, so to speak, because our culture, society, everything is structured. Systems are structured around the idea that we remain able-bodied. But if you live long enough, at some point you're going to need, support. Like, why isn't the world built more around that way? Why are we so geared, even in these horror films that we love and the culture that we love? It's really training us to hate the infernal, or to find it scary and monstrous. So, yeah, again, there's so much to try to talk about in your book. I wish I could have read this so much slower. I'm looking forward to reading it again, because obviously I wanted to make sure I read it all before we got a chance to talk, but there's still so much that I feel I'm like digesting. It was just, all right, so I wanted to come back around to Scream, because you write a lot about Scream throughout the book. You kind of reference it. We're sort of talking a little bit about it, Escape. So in the book, you talk about Kevin Williamson saying in an interview, it's about gay survival. The things I warmed to in the first film, the quips, the complex women, the homoeroticism of the ending, are all shared across a lot of queer media. But if you look beyond the universal queerness the film promises, it's not about gay survival after all. It's about gay escape. So I grew up in Ohio, in Cincinnati. So we sometimes say Ohio Techie. You know? A lot of my family was from Kentucky or from Appalachia. You know, that sort of, we were raised with that kind of sensibility. And definitely as a queer person in these tiny towns there, in and around Cincinnati, there was that feeling of like, I have to get out of here. You know, like I can't like survive here. And yeah, California becomes this kind of place. It's this California in like the Midwestern imagination or something, right? Like through film, and you kind of talk a lot about that in Scream. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk about that because that was a really, yeah, just going to California, coming here, and sort of what you experienced.
Of course. Yeah, so much of the crux of the main essay about Scream is about this idea of escape and the way in which these things that can easily be pinpointed as axes of difference are actually the same across location. It was really important to me to kind of write a book that's very regionally specific, especially as someone who hasn't seen a lot of writing about the I feel like sort of Southern writing, regional writing, sort of ebbs and flows throughout the industry. But at this current moment, I haven't seen a lot of queer writing about the rural South recently. And it was really important for me to kind of bring that forward, which is so much of what the Scream essay is about Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which is mainly where I grew up. But it's also about the ways in which you can fantasize about an elsewhere there. And so much of what I find fascinating about Scream is that it is a fantasy that then kind of becomes a reality, right? Kevin Williams and grew up in a small fishing town in North Carolina. And some of his other stuff, I think kind of most notably in the genre of horror, I Know What You Did Last Summer, are very rooted in those particulars. But he didn't make I Know What You Did Last Summer first, right? He made Scream first. And that kind of became the propulsive engine that sort of led to this other work that he made that was able to be more regionally specific. So what does it mean to have this kind of everywhere that is pretty distinctly Californian in that movie, made by someone who was very much not of California? And what does that mean that this was a film that I then grasped onto myself as well as a North Carolinian without even knowing that connection? Those are some questions I was interested in exploring in the essay and sort of in the book as well. It's kind of where the title comes from also.
Yeah, again, it resonated because I grew up in Ohio. I've lived here in San Diego now for 16 years. So it was definitely a fled like my area. And, you know, just was able to kind of make a life here. But it was really funny to kind of reflect back on, one, I left when I was 24. You know, so it's like, okay, you know, I was young, queer, wasn't really finding the political or the you know, the people that would kind of, you know, that made sense for me, I guess, you know, so I came here and, but yeah, I did find, I'm like, oh my gosh, there are times where it just reminds me of being at home in Ohio, you know, the same kinds of stuff, you know, it wasn't this magical place. And then going to LA and how to really watch the stars out of your eyes, and friends and family, oh, we're gonna come visit, we're gonna go to LA. I'm like, well, you want to go to a very specific part of LA that's not really real or is not really visitable, you know, or you want to go to like the Walk of Fame, which again, most people go, oh my God, I can't believe this is it, right? There's just these big ideas about what it means to be in California. And so I really enjoyed, like, I mean, being able to so confront your own implicit, explicit biases, however you want to look at it. You talk a lot about, obviously, the murder of Andrew Brown Jr., who was shot by the Elizabeth City Sheriff's Department, writing, it took a man in my hometown's murder for me to even fully realize how wrong I'd been. I wasn't merely an oppressed queer victim in my hometown. I was one of the beneficiaries of the place, too. I dreamed of California, fantasized of escape. I left because I always knew I could. Again, in Cincinnati, where I was growing up in April of 2001, Timothy Thomas was a 19-year-old boy, who was shot unarmed by the police. There were race riots for 5 days. And I remember the biggest concern of people around me was that our prom or some dance was going to happen downtown, and now it couldn't. It had to be moved to like a bingo hall, and you're like, you look back, and I didn't really care about the dance, but I can say I don't think I was, I was 16 or 17 when this happened, so even aware enough of kind of this larger police brutality conversation. But I just felt this echo in what you were talking about, leaving a space, and then also kind of finding now there are things I wish I could get back, or experiences that I took for granted or that I was dismissive of, like my grandmother, and recipes and stories and things that are now gone. She's gone. So it's this really, I don't know. There was just this interesting grief in reading your piece on a lot of levels, being sort of kind of having a similar, obviously not exact same experience, but similar experience that I was just like, wow, this really resonates, and kind of made it something I've been thinking about myself, just about what it means to leave a place that we're from and then blame it or scapegoat it or whatever it is,
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that it resonated, and I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm also in a really long lineage of writers who have been thinking critically about the South and about rural areas, often from places of exile, even self-imposed, right? I think of Dorothy Allison, who passed this past year. I think of Eli Clare. There are these writers who come from rural areas who are really interested in kind of breaking that down and like breaking the nuances down of all of that. And I very much am standing on their shoulders. And I think, especially since so much of sort of the South is community oriented in ways that can be deceptive, but can also be deeply sort of embracing, sort of acknowledging the larger literary community that I'm a part of is really important as well. But I'm glad to hear that all that resonates.
Yeah, I often think about, because I grew up like in the Southern Baptist Church, and though I identify as an atheist, I kind of really push away a lot of that. There was a lot of things I learned being in that space that were community driven. There are values and things that I kind of took away, and then there are other, other values, other beliefs, other behaviors and things that, I think there at one point, the younger me was very elitist about, academically elitist, or like I have to get out of this, kind of terrible place. That now it's like, oh, there are some very beautiful things about it. And again, it's not like I ran open arms into some, I thought like this hippie, politically, soft space kind of to land in, also was not true, coming here. There are definitely things that are, better about it for me overall, but just existing like as a queer person. But there's a lot to take away from the South. And again, there's always these discussions like, oh, if you don't like it, you should leave. But there are plenty of queer people, people, the global majority, women, like doing incredible work. Like, do we abandon all of these people? So it's a very it was a very powerful chapter but even though I know it's echoed throughout, but just the Scream chapter in general, I was like, oof. Things it's very confronting in us. Okay, so I did want to transition a little bit to talking about, so in the last book, you talk about Greer Lankton, who is somebody that I'm kind of sad to say I did not know of until I read your book. Now I went on and I ordered the monograph that's coming out, and now I'm looking for more information just because it was. So I'm curious why you decided to include the discussion of her and her work, because I'm really glad you did. Because like I said, this was very educational. I'm like, how have I never heard of this person? There were so many worlds that intersected with her that somehow I have been completely, ignorant of.
Of course. I think that For one, it was related to that sort of absence that you're talking about, right? Greer Lankton was a trans woman visual artist and doll maker, primarily active in the 80s and 1990s before her premature passing. And her art has really meant a tremendous and has remained kind of, while there's a mini resurgence going on right now, it's still gotten the critical attention I feel it deserves. There's part of just kind of writing as activism involved there in terms of bringing her life more to the surface. But I was also interested in thinking about these questions of what beauty can we find in horror and what survival can we find in the horror that I think her work really precisely captures. So by about her and by essentially the book with the story, I really wanted to sort of have a larger conversation of what are techniques we see in horror, the grotesque, the uncanny, the sort of unnatural, the nauseating, right? What are these things that are specific to horror movies that are also to prevent a life that we can live? And also, a lot of the book is kind of structured as an argument towards staying alive, right? And I think her life is one that did end prematurely. There's some debate about whether she died of intentional or whatever it is. But I think that through having this focus on her life, it was also an opportunity for me to argue for the importance of queer life more generally, especially when it makes us a little bit uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah. Again, that makes sense. And of course, in reading the book, the dolls and then like her art and then her own sort of, I don't know if it's like conflict with her own identity or kind of how she saw herself with other queer people, which again, I think is also something that, all of us kind of figure out where we're at, like on that spectrum, who we kind of, identify with or don't. So I really enjoyed that chapter a lot because again, it was so educational. Of course, there was a lot in the book that I'm like, yeah, I know this movie. Oh, I've read that article or I've read that. Yeah, I know what you're referencing. Obviously, you're doing this through, very much your own specific lens, but that was just one of the chapters where I'm like, oh, I just have never heard of this person. I'm so glad that you were able to bring them into this discussion and kind of talk about their life, their work, and beauty and the grotesque. It was just really, really cool. So I'm definitely looking forward to learning more about her and looking forward to that book coming out that will have images of like all of her dolls, her artwork. And then I think there's like a sketchbook or something. And then, so now I'm just like trying to learn all I can. So hopefully others will do the same once they read your book. Which kind of brings me to another piece that I really like about this is, so you talk about scary movies are scary because they show versions of ourselves we don't want to see. One's crueler or more ragged with trauma. They tell us what happens to us is irreversible. Our lives a sunset occurring once and never again. They tell us a person can only go so far until they snap. But humans aren't frozen rubber bands, stretchable to only a certain point before we break. Nor are we unstoppable monsters hurting everything around us until we're dead. We're blood and bone, and the things we've endured are committed by people who are those things too. And obviously, you're throughout the book talking about different relationships, people you've hurt, people have hurt you, intentionally, unintentionally, there's not always this maliciousness, right, to human pain. But there's also conversations about like what other like queer people have done. And you talked a lot about, or wrote a piece about that, about, kind of being bullied and then having those same individuals, identify as trans later in life, and that reflect. I mean, I had that same experience. I had a bully in high school who later I saw in like a gay pornographic movie, and I was just like, what? It kind of blew my mind a little bit. and it just sort of twisted kind of how I saw that person, even though they were really awful in high school. I just kind of wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and just this idea of scary movies like reflecting us too, in a way.
Of course. That was one of the main preoccupations of the book, and I think it became one of the main intellectual arguments I was interested in pursuing as well. I think that there's a tendency in some criticism of scary movies, especially more activist-oriented criticism, that kind of just inverts the terms of the movies, right? Because this character is viewed as queer or sort of marginal in some way, they actually become a source of strength and a source of identification. And I think there's a tremendous amount of power in doing that. But I also think that doesn't really speak to the full story, right? It doesn't hold the complexity for people who share our identity to also commit harm. And it was really important for me to, and one of the things I think horror actually does most effectively is the way it allows those readings and understandings to diffuse. And as such, it was, cats making a little appearance again. As such, it was really important for me to sort of think about this in terms of this larger question, right? What do we do if we've been hurt by someone who we try to find community with? And there are so many other films that are interested in that question as well, some of which I talk about, some of which I don't. But sort of continuing that train of thought was really important. In a lot of ways, I'm sort of uninterested in like simple stories and simple narratives, and I wanted to hold as much moral complexity within this work as I could. And horror becomes a really great way to sort of think about that, because of the way it troubles ideas of heroics and villainy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you sometimes see these critiques of, who was it that was just recently talking about this? Because they were told they couldn't, it was either a book or a show, movie, something where it's like, no, we don't want to publish that because we don't want to publish villains. We don't want to publish like a book or a story or something about a gay person who's bad, which there was like a discomfort around that, whereas like, I feel like that's kind of what I have been wanting to see is like us be allowed to be full people, like I remember when the show Animal Kingdom was on, which is like a crime show, and one of the sons on there is gay, and it's like, I have never seen this kind of character before, who's kind of brute and violent, but gay, and that not having anything to do with this other kind of side, that it was multifaceted. Again, not saying that's imperfect, like to hold it up, just saying it was interesting, or to see just other like kind of, is that like a storm?
Oh yeah, there's a very atmospheric kind of horror-esque thunderstorm that's happening in the background right now.
That's probably one of the biggest things I miss about living in Ohio. It's like a really good thunderstorm. So thank you. We get a little bit of that from but I wanted to go back because you had written something in the Texas Chainsaw chapter as well, Southern Fried, talking about I'm not interested in intention, which I thought was really interesting because, again, we're sort of talking about like horror as an art form. I do think is something that is really made up by the viewer. Like certainly somebody can write a film and have this intention, like, oh yes, I'm talking about the Vietnam War or something like that. But I don't really know if it happens that way all that often. Sometimes they just make kind of a story and then we imbue it with a lot of meaning. But I would be curious to hear more about like, your thought on that. I'm not interested in intention. Like, what did you mean by that? Because I was like, oh, that's good.
Yeah, I'm glad you paid attention to that. I think so much of this book is really interested in specific emotional responses to film and also interested in cultured responses as well. And I think so much of that can kind of go beyond the stated intentions of a work. And as such, I was really interested in sort of thinking through those implications, both in my own life and the lives of those I care about, and also largely culturally. as well. Like, to return to the ring, I'm sure there wasn't a conscious decision to make a pro-child abuse movie with that film. There was an intention to remake a popular Japanese movie that for a wider American audience. And to that end, they did that incredibly successfully. It's a really well-made movie.
Yeah.
I like aesthetically and kind of structurally really love the American version of The Ring quite a bit. But there is still this larger cultural legacy that it has. And I think thinking about that and not being bound by the intention of the creators was a way to think about that legacy more broadly and more emotionally as well.
Yeah, again, I think that's like something. It's like I haven't. Again, maybe it's out there. Maybe there are other books. I just haven't read them. But again, every time I see any queer or any horror analysis books, I tend to pick them up. But yeah, this just balances your book overall balances. So definitely that, like this critique and analysis, and cultural kind of conversation about horror with exactly the emotional experience of it. And as viewers of horror, and also as like queer viewers of horror. I mean, there's so many things I think anybody can take away from your work, in a variety of ways. That is just really, again, just keep coming back to, like, it's unlike other books I've read. All right, so I wanted to jump back a little bit, because something that I really also kind of going back and talking about complexities of like queer identities, trans bodies. You have one of the chapters here. You talk a lot about the Wolfman, werewolves, your own work within that realm. Film you were working on, Wolf Inventory. We are living in this time where, again, it's like, here we are, what is it, 30 some years after Silence of the Lambs, I don't even know, 50, 60, 70 years after Psycho, sort of these ideas about like transness and horror. Do it that way because I kind of side with the thought that Buffalo Bill isn't actually a trans person, as the film talks about. But regardless, people take away from it, what they want, or what they will. So I really liked your sort of the conflict in that chapter about talking about werewolves, sort of as a like allegory, metaphor for trans identities, but not really. Like, it doesn't fit, cleanly. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that and sort of the behind the chapter.
Of course. I think that legacy of trans people as predators, and specifically trans women as predators, was something that was sitting very heavily on me as I was writing this book, but especially that chapter.
Yeah.
But I think the flip side of that, as we've discussed, is that sanitizing representation isn't the response to sort of unnecessarily demonizing representation, right? The response to someone being like, you're bad, isn't to say, I'm good. It's to say, what else can we say about badness? Who else is impacted by these? And how do we think through this impact? And that essay was really trying to think through those impacts in real time. I was really interested in talking about what happens when someone you share community with hurts you, and how you can still find your way to community through that nevertheless. I think that it's ultimately the arc of the book, I hope, is ultimately hopeful because it is so community focused, but it's impossible to talk about community without talking about pain, right? That kind of becomes a false community. It gives people an impression of something that doesn't exist. And werewolves became a way to explore that because there's so much regret associated with werewolves. There's so much loss, but there's also so much kind of joy and transformation. And I think holding that, right, the ways in which transformation is presented as this thing that's inevitable, this thing that has to happen in a werewolf story, was something that's always been resonant with me, but especially as I've come into a trans identity. and seemed a place to hold a lot of complexity in ways that I also haven't seen that much discussion around. So it was really important for me to kind of wed those two things together, using werewolves as this way to think about transformation, but also to think about community more broadly as well.
Yeah, yes, and that does really resonate. And again, yeah, I mean, I think we covered ginger snaps, and obviously we talked a lot about puberty, and we had a woman on the show who was like it was her favorite movie, and so okay, let's talk about it. It's why, and that kind of thing, which is sort of what we do. And so reading the pieces about ginger snaps in here, but also then the Wolfman and sort of like this kind of queering of the Wolfman, but then the guilt of living in a body that is debated, is politicized, and then it's like I remember coming out, and it's like there is that attitude of like, what are you doing to us? That's like living authentically is a crime, or is you're causing pain, and then there's this guilt, and then of course you leave the place you're from, and so it was just like there's so much going on in that chapter that I definitely wanted to sort of wrap up with that, because it just was it's clear, trying to figure out what is like, there's not a perfect representation, because like life is messy, relationships are messy, humans are messy, horror is very messy, and it was just like I really appreciated that how you just took apart your own thoughts in that. I think it was really, again, just that unflinching, like you just really do this great job of interrogating your own thoughts on these things, that I think is really needed and necessary in this kind of critical work. All right, so to wrap up, I am curious, I know we were kind of talking about not being, all that interested in intention, but I am curious what your intentions are for the book. What do you hope that people take away, from reading this in that larger scale? Because I can see this being taught, there's so much in this book that I could see, out there in the world, especially now.
Of course. Well, that's really sweet of you to say, and it's a really great question. I think that my foremost intention was writing it is to write a book about the necessity of survival, especially for younger queer people, and finding ways to talk about survival that don't, as you highlighted with an earlier quote, that don't foreclose pain. I think that one of the failings of the It Gets Better campaign, which has been pretty widely criticized, is the way it sort of emphasizes that this narrative that pain ends. And what I'm interested in is, what if it doesn't, and what are the ways you can still build community and still build an urge to live through that? And I think horror is a really great way to explore that. I'm interested in sort of widening the scope of horror scholarship to kind of think about sort of personal impacts that it has more specifically as well, which is, again, building on sort of contemporary works as well. It Came From the Closet is a really great example of an anthology that's doing precisely that. But I was interested in taking this approach that kind of enshrines the importance of thinking about horror movies and thinking through horror movies and thinking through the horrific, but also is fundamentally rooted in an outlook that is explicitly pro-survival, and finding people who kind of are looking for that message, however this book finds them.
I love that. Yeah, I think that is, that's a big kind of goal. Like in my own work, it's like people kind of come to you and, they take medications, they go, oh, I still feel sad. And it's like, well, you're supposed to, you're a person, like there's pain in the world, and how do we destigmatize that rather than always this, I think we destigmatize mental health a lot. There's obviously still plenty of stigma and problems out there, but just destigmatizing like life as a human means a lot of complex emotions, pain being, one of them. And that we can survive anyways, I think is, a beautiful message. All right. What are you currently reading? Any recs that you have for us? Even new, old, doesn't matter.
That's a really great question. There are a couple of books that come to mind. I just read Gretchen Falker Martin's new novella, Black Flame, which is incredible. It's a kind of haunted film story that's very good. I
Okay.
also recently read this British novel, Penance, by Eliza Clark, who is most famous for Boy Parts, which is this kind of dark, sort of American Psycho-esque psychological thriller. But Penance is this novel that is about a fictitious true crime case where um, two teenage girls set their queer best friend on fire on the eve of Brexit. And it's one of the most singular books that I've read in quite a while. It's really striking. It was almost nauseating to read at moments, but it really pinpoints these moments of teenage cruelty and the larger political implications of true crime in a way that I haven't seen any other book do. So those are two recommendations that immediately come to mind.
Awesome. Wow. Definitely look that up. All right. And obviously, you're starting to kick off the promotion for the new book. Is there anything you can tell us about kind of what's up next for you?
Yes. So there are I'm not sure when this episode is going to be released, but there's going to be a book launch at Books Are Magic, the bookstore in Brooklyn, on October 8th. And I am planning some West Coast dates as well, which should be announced shortly, which I'm very looking forward to. And
Awesome.
I'm currently finishing up revisions on a draft of a horror novel as well, which I'm really excited about. It's sort of been in the works for a while, and it's exciting to kind of practice some of the theory of the book as well. Think about what I actually find scary and how to render that on the page.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to that. I hope that I definitely hope you make it over to the West Coast, Southern California, LA, somewhere close. So
There should be something in LA, definitely.
Awesome. I love that. Then yeah, definitely. I will have to come out and say hello. All right. Well, tell the folks where to find you on the things,
Of course. So you can find me at zefyrlisowski.com. That's my website. It's just my first name and my last name, no space. And then I'm also on Instagram at ZEF, and then I believe 17 R's. But if you keep typing, eventually you'll find me. I don't have a lot of competitor accounts at this current moment. So those are the two best places that you can stay in touch.
All right. Well, we'll make sure we definitely we'll have some links to that. So, Zefyr, again, thank you so much for a beautiful book, a thoughtful book, thought-provoking book, one that I am definitely looking forward to referring to for our future shows. Because again, there's a lot of stuff in it. Like, oh my gosh, we have to redo that movie now because we need to talk about this analysis. Revisit. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, dear listeners, dear watchers here on the Geekscape Network for checking us out. Good night.
Thank you.
Okay.